And I just feel like there's almost a sense of feeling rather self-important and like they've sort of got insider information and it's all part of some sort of conspiracy against dissident men, which is frankly nonsense.
British police last Friday charged Russell Brand with a string of rapes and sexual assaults dating back more than 25 years, as the New York Post reported. Brand, as you may know, does not exactly run from his past. It's actually a big part of his pitch and his appeal to the right. His baptism last May was reasonably celebrated by many of us. Now, though, Brand is scheduled to appear for an interview at the new College of Florida on Saturday. You may remember that as the school GOP Governor Ron DeSantis famously took over by appointing a conservative majority to the board 2 years ago. The school is standing by the event. Here's a rundown from NBC News. Quote, Brand was charged with 2 counts of rape, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 1 count of indecent assault, North London Chief Crown Prosecutor Jaswant Narwal said Friday. The charges are related to allegations of incidents from 1999 to 2005 involving 4 women, she said. He denied the allegations in a video on his social media platforms, including X, and said he intended to fight the charges. So, on that note, let's actually take a look at part of the video where Brand defended himself on X.
I've always told you guys that when I was young and single, before I had my wife and family, with just that shot over there, my beautiful children, I was a fool, man. I was a fool before I lived in the light of the Lord. I was a drug addict, a sex addict, and an imbecile. But what I never was a rapist. I've never engaged in non-consensual activity. I pray that you can see that by looking in my eyes.
Now, writing in Unheard, Josephine Bartosch argued that Brand's defenders on the right are reflexively rushing to stand by him. Quote, the manosphere podcasters, the Trumpian cheerleaders, and the faux philosophers with ring lights have all dutifully circled the wagons. Conservative commentator Charlie Kirk called the case a, quote, political prosecution, noting, accurately but irrelevantly, that the allegations surfaced only after Brand became a vocal critic of government and COVID narratives. When challenged, Kirk offered a gem of childlike earnestness. Quote, I'd know him, he said. Bartosch continues. Meanwhile, influencer Kaizen Sidhu offered his own analysis to his 300,000 followers. Quote, there's a pattern. Men who challenge Western governments keep getting accused of rape 20 years later. He concluded masculinity is under attack. Here's more from Bartosch. She writes, in a sense, they're right. A string of high-profile men have recently found themselves facing court. But to frame this as a political purge of dissident voices is to ignore a darker, more mundane truth. Sexual violence is all too common, and so is silence around it. The allegations against Brand date from before his conversion to Christianity and departure from the Gardenista set. Whether or not they are found to have substance, it is a fact that women have been questioning his behavior for a long time. End quote. So to be clear, I do not object to anyone engaging with Brand, especially on the topic of free speech, as the new College of Florida is. That is what colleges and universities are actually for. And many things can be true at once here, which is why I think this is a particularly fascinating case, aside from the fact, of course, that it involves one of the more influential voices in American politics, dare I say global politics right now, given the size of Brand's following. Politics can be influencing the effort to take him down. So that can be true. It could also be true that he is guilty. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And by the way, the fact that he might be guilty, given Brand's history, his self-admitted history, it's just not insane to believe. But he could also be innocent, which, given the history of the Me Too movement, is also not insane to believe. And another thing that could be true, we could all agree there's actually no need to rush to judgment. None of us need to be posting about this. We don't have to come down on one side or the other. That is to say, none of us need to be posting conclusively about this coming down on one side or the other. All of those things can be true at once. The court of public opinion and the court of law are two different things. What's interesting about the era of social media is that it does sort of play on our reflexes to stand by people, to see things through polarized lenses, rather than maybe just allowing things to play out. But again, if you're Charlie Kirk and you know Russell Brand, and you say this isn't him, this doesn't sound like him, this is a political persecution, you obviously want to stand up against the political persecution. You want to stand by your friend. So there's so many different motivations and variables wrapped into this one case. And we are now, 5 years out from the Me Too movement. So I think it's very worth digging into the case of very popular podcaster, influencer Russell Brand. Let's bring in Jo Bartosch to talk all about this, to talk about her article over at Unheard, which you should check out at unheard.com. Jo, thank you for being here. Have you noticed prices creeping up? I know you've noticed prices creeping up. Groceries, gas, everything's costing more. Tariffs are kicking in, markets are all over the place, and people are wondering, is your retirement built to handle this? Well, that's exactly why we've partnered with Augusta Precious Metals, because when the economy shifts, smart investors look for ways to protect what they've built, and historically gold has done just that, holding its value through inflation, recessions, and even financial crises. A gold IRA lets you own real physical gold inside your retirement account. More investors, especially those with at least $50,000 in retirement savings, are turning to this as a way to hedge against uncertainty. If you're curious about how it works, Augusta Precious Metals put together a free guide that breaks it all down: how gold IRAs work, why they're in demand, and whether they make sense for you. No cost, no catch, just information you can use. Click the link in the description and grab your copy today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Now, in this really interesting piece you wrote for us at Unheard, you note that Charlie Kirk, for example, called this case against Russell Brand, quote, political prosecution. Kirk said, you refer to this as childlike earnestness. I know him. It is true that we've seen a response to the new charges against Brand be treated as a political prosecution. So what do you make of, like, if we just steel man their argument, this is a political prosecution, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's easy to say, isn't it? But we know that, if you talk to anybody who works, for example, in a rape crisis centre, it can often take decades for victims to have the courage to come out and talk about what's happened to them. On the same day as I wrote that article, there was a British Labour MP who was done for or has been charged with historic allegations of child abuse. So it can, and that was in sort of the 2000s as well. So it can take a very long time for these things to come out. And I just feel like there's almost a sense of feeling rather self-important tonight, that sort of got insider information, and that it's all part of some sort of conspiracy against dissident men, which is frankly nonsense.
And I feel like these cases, whether it's Andrew Tate or in this case Russell Brand, sometimes split the right, and maybe we don't see it in public because people who would be eager to criticize a leftist who gets hit with these accusations, even if they're 20 years later, whatever, will just hold their fire, keep their powder dry when it comes to someone
Right.
like Russell Brand. Is your sense that the right has sort of been circling the wagons around Brand, who is seen as a pretty valuable asset to the kind of realignment politics? Somebody who comes from the left, from the sort of crunchy left, and is now kind of crunchy right, pro-Trump, has found faith. He's a pretty big asset for conservatives, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think here in the UK, he's sort of mostly remembered as being a slightly irritating Mockney comedian, and obviously he's now sort of reinvented himself as Mr. Messiah. And there were fair enough points to some of what he says, and I think he is tapping into something that is genuine and needs to be expressed. Though I am perhaps a little cynical about why he has chosen to do so, and indeed just the eagerness with which his defenders have jumped on to support him. I mean, it's a bit random, but it sort of puts me in mind of there's a feminist theorist called Carol Pateman. She came up with this idea of the sexual contract, and that's the idea that men are given women as chattels, as wives, or as prostitutes, historically, in order to keep dissident men in line. And I feel that sort of underlying sense of entitlement kind of feeds through some of these narratives. And yeah, I think they're possibly seeing something a bit deeper playing out with this tribalism.
Well, it's an interesting distinction with Brand because he's claiming that he was not guilty. And then
Mhm.
on the same time, there are some people who seem to be saying, well, even if he was guilty, it was a very, very long time ago, which is kind of an argument actually just against the statute of limitations. And that seems like those are two totally different arguments, actually. And if he's totally denying these charges and he's saying, which he is, I didn't do any of this, that's somewhat different than saying, well, it was years ago and he's a changed man now. Even changed men, if there's if there are no statute of limitations, are still supposed to answer in our system for their prior wrongs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the interesting thing about him is, he's sort of painted himself as being a victim of the circumstances of which he was a part of the sort of culture of which he was a part at the BBC in the early 2000s, and I think that's sort of and obviously it's much easier for the right in particular to sort of point the finger and go, oh yes, it's a corrupt organisation that corrupted a good man, than it is to perhaps acknowledge, in fact, that sexual violence is very common and that it spans all political persuasions and that people they like, people they know, people we all know will be predators. I'm not saying that Brando is or isn't, that's kind of irrelevant. But the point is they've been so quick to defend somebody because he's managed to very sort of, I think, skillfully use this narrative.
And can you talk to us a little bit about how somebody like Charlie Kirk, who is a family values type, anti-sexual revolution conservative, is there a problem with him kind of having this reflexive conspiracism when it comes to Russell Brand? It seems to me that a lot of these people see everything now through the lens of Trump, meaning there was a genuine sort of conspiracy to undermine Trump. And because there was some truth to that, there was truth to that, it sort of like feels as though it's running the same playbook back every single time. And that's the only lens now a lot of us on the right have to look at some of these allegations. That's kind of a problem because the idea that sexual Lothario, libertine Russell Brand may have engaged in non consensual activities when he, by his own admission, was, a sort of drug addled mess, that doesn't seem entirely implausible.
No, it doesn't. And I mean, he said that he can't remember. I'm sure, if his victims, or if his alleged victims, have their day in court, I'm sure they will be able to remember. Um, and yes, I mean, it is. I think that's sort of, I guess, suppose it's part of a broader issue of polarization,
Mm.
which sounds rather hackneyed, but it's true. And I think, to be honest, for years, I come from the left. I'm no longer on the left, but we've always had this problem, that I've naively thought for a while was perhaps confined to the left of sort of vocalists, if you like, slapping each other on the back, and we've had sort of cover-ups with the Socialist Worker Party in the UK and all these, and men basically having one another's backs when it comes to these allegations. Whereas actually, I mean, the paradigm I always come from when I'm looking at these things is one of sexual politics and is
Mm.
one of the male versus women divide, and just how those sort of power dynamics work more so than any left or right division, because I think it cuts right through everything.
Well, and what's really interesting about that is the sexual politics and the male women dynamic is where the sort of I don't know how the right word, the former, a lot of people who used to be on the left, probably yourself included, and some people on the right in recent years have said, okay, so we actually have this fundamental agreement, which is that men and women are different, and that is
Yes.
salient in our politics. The sexual politics are real and salient to politics downstream of all of that. But that fundamental agreement doesn't you can't necessarily build the same house just because that foundation is kind of agreed upon.
No, and I guess the way that it's perhaps approached is different, depending on your sort of philosophical background, if you like. I mean, we can all agree material reality is a thing, in how it plays out, but how much of that is socialization and how much of that is innate, I think, is probably something that the
Hmm.
right and the left would tend to disagree on to some extent.
Toxic
Um,
masculinity, the conversation about that is a good example. Like toxic masculinity, the right should say like, well, yes, we do believe in toxic masculinity, but we believe that it's a sort of this inherent thing. Whereas a lot of people on the left will say that this is socially constructed.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to, I mean, yes, to be honest, I don't know what I think anymore when it
Hmm.
comes to how much is constructed and how much is innate. I think I sort of sit somewhere in the messy middle. Um, but um, but yeah, certainly you have somebody like Matt Walsh, who I think is, to my mind, every bit um, as dogmatic as a trans activist in terms of he thinks there are men's roles and women's roles. And actually, I think that's probably part of the problem and why so many sort of people are kicking against that.
Mm.
I think if we had a little more lassitude and perhaps while still acknowledging biological reality, that would help us all.
I don't think anyone necessarily has good answers to this question, but I think back to a line Camille Paglia wrote in the Hollywood Reporter around it was around the Me Too era, where she said the idea of artists as moral actors is a quote sentimental canard of Victorian moralism. The idea that that an artist must be a good person is a sentimental
Yeah.
canard of Victorian moralism, and that's where litigating so much of this in the media is a really difficult exercise because people want to sort of either jump to conclusions that he's guilty or innocent based on the media reports, the media coverage, based on polarization. And I'm just curious, Joe, how you see this conundrum of recognizing that some really interesting people in media in Hollywood um, are artists with complicated backgrounds, and maybe they have interesting art to contribute to the world, interesting thoughts to contribute to the world. Maybe they haven't always been great people. How do we then go about consuming their work or treating them as members of the public?
To be honest, I've always very much been one for separating the art from the artist.
Hmm.
I think when you look at yeah, so many of my favorite songs, so much of my favorite art is was and is sung and made by by misogynists. um, it's something I think you just have to kind of deal with. Um, and yeah, I think if you sort of are too narrow in your approach and you siphon yourself off, I think it's the same as tearing down statues, isn't it? I mean, it's perfectly possible to appreciate the art and to separate it from the creator. And I think as well, there's probably a higher likelihood that people who tend to be successful are perhaps more likely to have personality defects that
Hmm.
make them successful, which may also involve, for example, using prostitutes and generally being a scumbag.
Many such cases. Yes. And lastly, as we're thinking about this, I mean, we could fill many books with some of these questions because they're fascinating and difficult. But I also just wonder one part where the left and right kind of found agreement among like skeptics of the Me Too movement was that it had totally eliminated the room for forgiveness. And our legal system is different than our media courts, the court of public opinion. So the
Mhm.
actual court is different than the court of public opinion, and it seems like it's really hard to disentangle those two things when people feel like they have to weigh in on what's going on with Russell Brand. When in fact, I mean, maybe he has changed, and he is. Let's just take him at his word. Changed, wonderful, lots of regret. Maybe he's also guilty. And then maybe on top of this is a political persecution because now he's very famous, and there are people who are very irritated by the fact that he's very famous, and it sort of leaves you wondering what to do with someone of that level of prominence. And I know that's kind of a jumbled mess of a question, but I feel like there are a lot of jumbled variables when we're trying to sift through these cases.
I suppose we've all got something. This is something that I feel terribly sorry for younger people about who've grown up during the age of smartphones. Is that there will always be something there. They can never escape their opinions, their past behaviour, stupid things they've said and done will be recorded and can be dug up and can destroy careers, sort of however many years later. Having said that, we are not seeing when it comes to rates of prosecutions for rapes and sexual assaults, and they're at an all-time low here in the UK, at least. So the reporting's going up, but the prosecution rates are going down. So I think it's very easy to sort of do oh, everybody deserves forgiveness and all the rest of it. But actually, we're not seeing justice in the courts either. So in a way, actually, I think Me Too and all those sorts of calls out on social media are a response to a failing judiciary.
And it leaves us at this place where, if you're Charlie Kirk, not to keep picking on him because there are other people who did this, you don't actually have to weigh in and adjudicate his guilt. Maybe it's a political prosecution, maybe he's guilty, maybe he's not guilty. But one of the things we heard from people throughout Me Too was let the courts handle this. And it's just interesting to see, as you point out in the article, the right, when the shoe's on the other foot, say, oh no, like this legal case, these victims, this is all political. Don't let the courts play it out. I guess it is sort of a contrast.
Yeah, and I mean, it is also worth pointing out that sort of 20 years ago, when I mean, not to sort of constantly go on about Brand, because obviously it's far bigger than him, but when he was called out for some particularly unpleasant behaviour during a telephone interview that he'd done, him and Jonathan Ross. He then said that it was a sort of politically motivated attack by the right and by the sort of the forces of institutions, because at the time he was very much on the left. So I think this is something that does get pulled up and relied upon to excuse the inexcusable.
It's so interesting. Joe, thank you for your time and for writing this article.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, and over at undercurrents.tv, you get a premium edition of the show, a newsletter, an email address to reach us. And actually, I'm already planning tomorrow to tape our premium video for this week, which is a Q&A with a question that one of you wonderful members of the Undercurrents community sent in, and I'm really excited to answer it. So make sure to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv if you want to support the show and join the community. Back to Brand for just a moment. If you watch the show often, you probably know that the question of social media technology is almost always on my mind, and it's one of the lenses that I just have a hard time removing from my view every time I'm looking at a story like this, and I don't think that's unreasonable. There's something interesting about the way social media incentivizes conclusivity. It incentivizes team, I guess it incentivizes team play, right? You get rewarded for having conclusive takes in one direction or the other. The algorithm recognizes that as strong emotion, and it plays on other people's strong emotions, so it gets fed back to us more often. We engage with it more because it's sort of playing to our baser instincts, for better or worse, in certain cases. And we end up probably weighing into things we don't even need to weigh into. And they create these news cycles around reactions that, let's just say social media didn't exist, might have been shared publicly, might have been shared with more ambivalence. And it's just something that seems to me is jet fuel on polarization. And I don't really see that ending anytime soon, because so many of these multi-billion-dollar multinational companies are now based on this business model of engagement farming. So that's a sort of scary thing. And I thought that often about Me Too. We used to see that with clickbait. When the algorithms were rewarding clickbait, we still see this a little bit. There was a rush to weigh in and to adjudicate these cases immediately in the court of public opinion, right away. Because, some people had sponsorship deals. Some people were debating whether or not to go to movies, like a Woody Allen movie or the Louis C.K. movie, I Love You, Daddy, which came out around the time of the accusations against him. Well, it didn't actually end up coming out. But anyway, all that is to say, it's not exactly necessary to be engaging in some of these conversations in published media. And by that, I mean actual publications, but also social media, where we hit publish, send on our opinions, and they live and are broadcast. Whether you have a lot of followers or not, they are broadcast to a broad audience. So some of that is really tricky. And I think, if you're someone who defends conservative family values, the nuclear family, Christianity, and even if you know and trust and love Russell Brand, it seems odd to side with him over the accusers, instead of just letting it play out. Maybe your post is, I love Russell and I'm going to let this play out. It just seems odd to me to immediately jump to it is necessarily a political prosecution. And because it is a political political persecution, because it is that, it can't be legitimate. So Joe's thoughts, I found them helpful, as somebody on the right, to kind of wade through these complicated questions. I go back to that Polya line all of the time. It's a sentimental canard of Victorian moralism, to expect our artists to be good people. That's another one of these difficult variables. Of course, you should watch the movies. You should watch Woody Allen movies. You should watch Louis C.K. Like, that's all fine. If we made these distinctions, we wouldn't be able to consume basically any art. But that also doesn't mean that you have to say this is a political persecution. So these are hard subjects to work through. But I appreciate you all for tuning in, for coming back day after day. Thank you. And we will be back here on a very busy news week, news month, news year, with more Undercurrents soon.